And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Victor Hoskins, the President and CEO of Fairfax County Economic Development Authority. So Victor, go ahead and take it away. Thank you all again for attending.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Victor Hoskins. I'm the President and CEO of Fairfax County Economic Development Authority. And before I begin, I want to thank Bob Lazaro and Dale Medeiros for their tremendous vision in actually doing a lot of work in this area, and it's something that we've partnered with them on. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, along with my colleagues from the Northern Virginia Regional Commission and Johns Hopkins University's Foreign Policy Institute. Today's webinar links two often overlooked but powerful and interconnected phenomena: global economic engagement through foreign investment, and how that dynamic has the power to affect sustainable development. If Northern Virginia were an independent country, its $276 billion economy would be the 48th largest in the world. With that said, monitoring foreign economic engagement is important for Northern Virginia. Our region is home to 1,250 foreign business establishments that invest more than $6.8 billion in wages, mostly in the science, technical services, and information services. The transatlantic economy is especially relevant for Virginia in general and Northern Virginia in particular. In a first-of-its-kind study on foreign direct investment conducted by NVRC in collaboration with partner agencies, including the Fairfax County Economic Development Authority, it was found that 6 of the 10 largest foreign investors in Northern Virginia are from Europe. Together, these 6 countries invest approximately $4 billion into 570 foreign-owned establishments, creating over 30,000 jobs. The power of these economic relationships play out in exceptional ways in Northern Virginia. For example, the United States currently accounts for over 53% of the world's operational hyperscale infrastructure measured by critical IT load. More than 1/3 of the US hyperscale capacity is in the Commonwealth of Virginia, which has far more hyperscale data capacity than China and all of Europe. Furthermore, European companies are the leading source of foreign direct investment in the US energy sector, and much of it in renewable energy. The union of these two forces, coupled with the US Inflation Reduction Act, has the powerful potential to further impact the mutual beneficial adoption of sustainable energy and related technologies. Today, we will hear from our experts, Dan Hamilton and Jill Kniff. Dan is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's Center on the United States and Europe, and he is president of the Transatlantic Leadership Network and senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Dan has served in a variety of senior positions at the U.S. Department of State, including Deputy Assistant Secretary for Foreign European Affairs, U.S. Special Coordinator for Southeast European Stabilization, and Associate Director for Policy and Planning Staff for 2 U.S. Secretaries of State. Dan has a doctoral and master's degree with distinction from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and his undergraduate degree is from Georgetown University. Jill Kniff is a senior regional demographer, GIS analyst at NVRC, where she manages the organization's demographic, data, and GIS programs. Her demographic career has included 19 years in government in the Northern Virginia region and additional years in the private sector. She joined the Northern Virginia Regional Commission in 2019. Jill has applied her demographic GIS and data management and analysis expertise extensively in the realm of government service planning, urban planning, economic development, and resiliency planning. Jill holds a Bachelor's of Science in Geography from James Mason University and a Master's of Science in Geography from the University of South Carolina. The run of show today is straightforward. Dan will share the details of his report on the transatlantic economy. Jill will follow with and share details about the foreign direct investment report for Northern Virginia, and Dale Medeiros of NVRC will facilitate a question and answer session. If you have any questions during the presentation, please share them in the chat box. We look to close by 1:15 p.m. And now I would like to hand the virtual mic to our experts. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Victor. So it's really a pleasure to be here with you today. So our division of labor is I'm going to provide a sort of a broad overview of how we should think about how the United States is connected globally, but how it's connected particularly Europe, and then drill down to Virginia's part of that. It's based on a study we do every year called the Transatlantic Economy. It's updated every year, provides actually all the data on jobs, trade, and investment for each of the 50 US states from Europe and US job, trade, and investment in all of the major European economies, about 40 European economies. That's available online at transatlanticrelations.org. You just go there and the whole study is there. There are also sections on US, Europe, and China and on Russia sanctions and lots of fun stuff like that. So I'm just going to do some top line slides just to illustrate a few points. Dale's going to help me with that. So we'll go to the first slide. The story, this year and last year has been lots of turbulence in the global economy. And you can see all of the issues there that we're facing together, our European colleagues as well. It's quite a bit. If you put the COVID pandemic, on top of that, we've gone through some real turbulence in the last few years. That's why I say it's all been shaken a bit. But the real story, though, is how we weathered that storm. And next slide, please. Basically, the economy is, proven to be quite resilient and robust across the Atlantic. These are historic record-breaking numbers from last year, latest data, that US companies based in Europe never made more money than they did last year. European companies never made more money in history in the United States than they did last year. US trade in goods with European Union is more than our trade with China. It's more than the Europeans trade with China. The earnings that companies make in Europe at historic records on both sides of the Atlantic. The new big story has been energy, because Europe suddenly had to divest itself of dependence on Russia for energy, and the US stepped in. So the US is now the #1 supplier of liquefied natural gas and petroleum oil to Europe, and Europe is now our major #1 purchaser of both crude oil and LNG. That's a story that didn't exist just a couple of years ago. Now it is vaulted to the forefront. And I should just add that on energy, which we could talk about if you'd like, it also includes, as Victor said, renewable energy. US companies are the largest investors in the European renewable energy sector, and European companies led by Germany are the largest sources of greenfield foreign investment in the US energy sector. So those are all big lead trends. Next slide. Sorry. It underscores the point that when companies go international, they tend to use the transatlantic economy as sort of a common base. That's why I call it our geoeconomic base. They don't think one jurisdiction or another. They want to be close to their customer and build on the synergies they can use across the Atlantic. And that makes the transatlantic economy simply the world's dominant force, $8.7 trillion economy, 6.9 trillion in commercial sales. 16 million workers on both sides of the Atlantic owe their jobs directly just to the investment part of that. If you add trade and knock-on effects, indirects, suppliers, and so on, that number would mushroom. But we're keeping it conservative. That's still a big number. We still together account for 2/3 of the foreign investment stock in the world, half of global consumption, and 1/3 of GDP. So that's how companies tend to work, is they tend to use the synergies they have by establishing a base on both sides of the Atlantic if they can. Next slide. And this shows just a quick contrast how US companies have been investing in Europe. The big bars there are all Europe for this century. And the little tiny bars, sometimes you can't see them, are Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and South Africa put together. You see there's no trend going in some other direction. Europe remains by far our major destination for investment for the US. And the same is true the other way around. Next slide. So one thing to think about often is in the newspaper, you often see talk about trade deficits and so on, and we'll get to some trade things. But in the transatlantic economy, the real driver of our commercial ties is investment and not trade. It's much more significant. Companies want to be close to their customer rather than send stuff across the ocean if they can. And so many American companies for decades have gone to Europe, set up shop next to those customers, and European companies for decades have been coming our way and doing the same, being as close to the customer as they can be, being inside the North American market. And so the sales of the affiliates, that is US companies in Europe, versus our exports to Europe is just miles ahead, right? You can see that right there. The big bar is how companies based in Europe, US companies and their sales versus our exports. So when you see in the newspaper about trade, it's usually about trade and goods, and trade is only one piece of commerce. And so it's very misleading if you only think trade is commerce. It's not. The more dynamic piece is investment. And it works both ways. Next slide, please. The same is true if you see this way. European companies based in the United States overwhelmingly, get their sales that way rather than sending stuff across the ocean. Yeah, in terms of imports from that the U.S. imports. And the dynamic trend is that investment-driven relationship. So investment is where the action is, not goods trade, even though goods trade is still the biggest in the world. So I'm not dismissing it, biggest in the world, but not where the dynamism is in terms of opportunities. Next slide. The other thing you read about in the newspaper often when they say trade, a journalist would say trade, they almost always mean just trade in goods. So look carefully at any graph you see in a newspaper and see if they actually make that distinction. They usually don't. But trade is not just trade in goods, it's trade in services and trade in goods. Services are where the jobs are. 80% of the US economy is the jobs are in services, not manufacturing, although manufacturing is still important. But services is where the dynamism is. Again, it's the fastest growing part of trade. And again, the services linkages are huge. We are essentially the only two real services economy in the world. The only other ones are Canada, Australia, basically. That's about it. Nobody else. And so our services companies like to use that transatlantic base to be globally competitive. And you can see that in that chart there. In the next slide, it works the other way around as well. These are services linkages in terms of services supplied in the United States by European companies. And you see the top line there is the dynamic line. That's what European companies are trying to do, invest here, and they're looking for places to invest to provide those services. Next slide. Another real distinctive element about the transatlantic economy versus all others is the digital economy, which is becoming the economy. Data flows across the Atlantic are twice what they are across the Pacific. And they're the densest and busiest in the world. And they've been building out at an extensive rate, including from Virginia through subsea cables, which I'll get to in a minute. But if you look at how data flows really connect our economies these days, it's quite significant. If you add that to the point I mentioned about services, what they call digitally enabled services is the fastest growing part of trade in the world. And we are the most competitive in the world in that part of trade. And Europe is our most important partner for that. And it's, again, overwhelming. US exports of digitally enabled services to Europe are double what they are to the entire Asia Pacific region. And we are the biggest source of, biggest customer for European suppliers of that. More, about the same as all of Asia, Oceania combined, is just the United States for Europe. One country versus half of humanity. So it's really important to keep these dynamics in mind because digitally enabled services are, again, moving very fast. You're able to do things today you could never do just a few years ago in terms of providing your services or products through the digital world. And it's foremost, and the fulcrum of it is in the Atlantic Ocean. Next slide. You see this, what I just said, the dynamism there, the top line is digitally delivered services, the fastest growing segment of international trade, far outpacing goods and even other services. Next slide. And you see the top two lines there are North America and the European Union, ahead of the whole world and far ahead of other parts of the world in terms of where the dynamism is. And the point is those two lines are each other's best customers as well. So next slide. This one's a little busy, but just to break it down, on the left, you just go, this is European EU exports of these kinds of services around the world. You see it's mainly to themselves, of course, but if you take the first non-European partners, the United States, on the left-hand side there, and you say what I just said, that compare that, it's about the same as all of Asia and Oceania in terms of being Europe's customer. And if you go to the right-hand slide, being Europe's supplier, and go to the right-hand side, the same. The United States, if you look, third bar down there, is the source of a huge amount of digitally enabled services to Europe. It's double what all of Asia and Oceania provide to Europe. So this is a real competitive advantage for US companies and frankly also for European companies. And it's synergistic because we're feeding each other's services economies in ways because of that dynamic investment density. We're just interconnected. And so it's not a either or kind of choice. Companies are using the big base of the transatlantic economy to do their business. Next slide. And you look at this in terms, most data goes under the sea, not through the air. 99% of data flows through subsea cables. And you can see how thick the density is, how busy those cables are in terms of US and Europe compared to how they are elsewhere. And that's significant for Virginia because of its role in the digital economy, which we'll come to in a minute. But just to give you that sense of, where is globalization thick and thin, not just more or less, but thick and thin, and it's thickest across the Atlantic. Next slide. So the summation here, our trade with China is like a 2-lane country highway. It's all goods trade. It can get busy on that highway. Same the European-China highway, it's goods trade. You have an accident on a 2-lane highway, you're in trouble. But the transatlantic relationship is a 12-lane Autobahn. We've got trade in goods, we got the jobs, we got services, we have the digital world, the investment drivers, and, which I haven't even mentioned, we are each other's most important partners when it comes to the innovation economy. European companies invest more in the US innovation economy, research and development, than anybody else by far. And the same is true the other way around. So if we're going to go into the clean tech space, if we're going to innovate, the new world, digital world, it's really based on these transatlantic R&D connections that are driving much of that. Next slide. So just the key takeaways, which I've mentioned. We're already each other's most important trading partners in goods, but investment is the real driver. That's where the money is. That's where the jobs are. And the services versus goods dichotomy is something always to keep in mind. And that is the dynamic there. Okay, next slide. So then we come briefly to Virginia. I'm just going to do this briefly because my colleague is the specialist and she's going to tell you much more about that. But just see the top line, you can see, 155,000 jobs in Virginia directly from that European investment. And I would estimate, this is just my top of the envelope estimate, because as I said, it doesn't include trade. That's not the jobs from trade. Imports or exports, and it's not the jobs from suppliers, indirect, kinds of knock-on effects that down the supply chain. So I could estimate close to 400,000 jobs in Virginia. That's a huge amount of jobs. related to Europe in some way. And that 77% of all those jobs sourced from Europe to the United States in Virginia are from Europe, with the UK, Netherlands, Germany, France, the top ones. Canada then comes in, not European, but our close neighbor. But if you look at that and you compare it to other states, it's 13th. Virginia is the 12th most populous state, but it's 13th. So while all this is good news, it seems like there's probably some room to grow. So there's things that could be built on here. And in terms of greenfield investments, new investment, not mergers and acquisitions or anything. Germany is the top one in Virginia, with the UK just following. Next slide. That's all of Virginia, not Northern Virginia, which I think we'll come to. And then if you look at this is about jobs. And you see Virginia kind of further down the line there, but again, it's not the most populous state. So you would expect California or Texas, New York to have higher numbers. But you can see the Virginia line. It's kind of been holding steady for the last 3 years. We went through COVID, so that's a problem. But it's gone up. But there's probably some room for growth there as well. But it's higher than, for instance, South Carolina, which is touted a lot as being a huge center of the automotive industry from Germany, less jobs than in Virginia. Virginia really, holds its own there. Okay, next slide. So my point again, goods trade still important. It's not the driver, but it's a foundational element of our commerce. And again, very big, $7.1 billion to Europe. And again, the top markets you see there, including, interesting, Poland, not just Western Europe. There's a real story of Poland over for the US economy, that when the Berlin Wall fell, the Cold War ended, there was basically no investment in Poland from the United States. Now it's huge. And it's been a shift of US companies within Europe, not away from Europe, but within Europe, from places like the UK and France to Poland. And so Poland now, US companies, about 250,000 Poles own their jobs to American companies. That's bigger than Spain. And it's a real dynamism that's going on now within Europe as US companies take advantage of the big single market that they have. But Virginia exports 2.5 times as much to Europe as it does to China. But again, it's only 21st in the country, so 12th most populous state. Probably room to grow. In terms of imports, even bigger, $11.2 billion in imports from these countries. You would think the big ones, but also Austria. And that's because of supply chains work. A customer in Virginia might want something from Europe. It starts in Austria, it's assembled there, and then sent maybe to Germany, where it's further assembled and sent to Virginia. But Austria is part of the big supply chain. So Austria, even though a smaller country, has real value as a partner. Sometimes these smaller European countries are overlooked in terms of how they fit into the supply chain. Austria, in terms of clean technology, in terms of advanced manufacturing, a major competitor. And it's tied into the German-led, manufacturing machinery industry within the EU single market. So next slide. Services, again, I mentioned, very dynamic. It's where the jobs are. It's not aligned by the commission's orders, as I understand, but with the congressional districts. So you see how important that is for the 8th, 10th, and 11th Virginia congressional districts in terms of digital services that I said, and also the top market both times, Europe. And that is where Virginia is ahead of the US share overall. You are a leading services economy and a leading digital services economy, way ahead of most US states. Next slide. This is the graphic of what Victor mentioned at his introduction in terms of data centers. Companies are increasingly locating data centers where they can, and Virginia has huge capacity. Just Virginia has more data center capacity than all of China and all of Europe, just Virginia. and it's a third of the US capacity. And much of it is in Northern Virginia. There are issues there. I think you're grappling through some of them. They eat up lots of water, electricity. So these are issues we contend with, but those are issues based on new money coming to your state, new investment coming your way. And it's issues of success in a way that's very different than if nobody showed up. So Virginia is, the leader in the world in terms of this new phase of the digital economy. Next slide. And it's important because Virginia is becoming a major digital port for the Atlantic world. After 9/11, when September 11th hit, afterwards, people researched and they found that New York City, Manhattan, had 4 cable linkages that connected the entire eastern seaboard. They're all right in Manhattan, only. So if September 11th had been worse, it would have knocked out all of the digital capacity in the United States and on the eastern half of the United States. And so there was a big effort to say we have to diversify. And so since then, digital ports have been emerging all along the East Coast of the United States, in New Jersey, in Virginia Beach, Myrtle Beach, and they're continuing. They're obviously competing a bit with each other, but what they're doing is building out this space that you can see all those linkages now further down the Atlantic coast. And if you think about Virginia Beach being where the land and sea cables come together, and then Northern Virginia being where the data centers are, and then Virginia being a leading digital economy, you have the future if you can make the most of those linkages and build on them. Next slide. This just shows the dynamism in the cable routes under the sea. The top line there is transatlantic. You can just see it's being built out incredibly, and it's being driven now by content providers rather than the old telecoms. So Google, everybody wants Netflix. They want you to watch their movies. They want you to have big bandwidth needs, and they've been not only building it, they start to own these things. So the content providers are basically taking over much of that dynamic. That's going to be important for a state like Virginia. It's also bypassing the public internet because businesses prefer to be connected instantaneously to their customers through these cables. So there's something called business interconnection, which is a huge booming business. That's not the internet. And that's where businesses want to be now because they want to be assured of those digital links are safe and secure. And again, that's probably an important thing for Virginia to consider, how to interact with that new dynamic. Next slide. So there you go. That's my overview. I think we're going to take it now to Northern Virginia and to more data to drill down a bit further. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And again, if anybody has any questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them after Jill's presentation.
Hello, everyone. This is Jill Caniff. I'm with NVRC, so it's a pleasure to be here. And I will wait for Dale to share the presentation, then I'll begin. Right. So I'm going to talk about the foreign direct investment in Northern Virginia. You just heard about Virginia. So now we'll focus on the Northern Virginia region that Northern Virginia Regional Commission represents.
Oops. Sorry.
Okay. So Northern Virginia Regional Commission, we're a council of 13 local governments in the Northern Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C. And NVRC's primary focus has been providing information, performing professional and technical services for its member jurisdictions, and serving as a mechanism for regional coordination. The region itself has a population of 2.5 million people, which constitutes 29% of the population of the Commonwealth of Virginia, yet 42% of the state's gross economic output is in Northern Virginia. And our geographic area is only 3%. So we have a really large population, very dense, and great economic output given the size of our area geographically. Next. So Northern Virginia Regional Commission focuses on a few priorities, specifically the climate change and resilience infrastructure. We focus on affordable housing, social services and health, as well as renewable energy and workforce development. And all of these are for both our domestic and our international programs. Next. The core elements of NVRC's international work, they include the transfer and application of our policy and technical innovations from overseas to the benefit of Northern Virginia's economy, the environment, and its communities. We also prioritize the countries from which to learn based on our economic engagements, such as foreign direct investment. And we partner with the region's academic institutions, science, research, and civil society, commercial, and government partners to facilitate the transfer and adoption of our lessons from abroad. And one example of this, of where we have applied our transfer of knowledge and innovations, is NVRC's collaboration with its counterparts in metropolitan regions, such as Stuttgart, Germany, and others, which has informed our climate resiliency, our watershed restoration, and low-impact stormwater development programs, and much more across the region of Northern Virginia. So why did we do an FDI study? As Mr. Hamilton said, investment is where the action is. NVRC just completed the foreign direct investment study to give NVRC and its local governments the tool to help plan strategically, as well as to prioritize our overseas engagements. We strive to support economic diversification and growth with more data-driven strategic applications like this FDI report. And we strive to search for overseas investments and innovations in a data-driven way. Climate change, public health, education, immigration, urban infrastructure, economics, and much more propels our region and its local governments to act internationally. Next. So the FDI report, we have used it in several capacities to date. And by the way, it was published earlier this year. And it's helping us in ways such as developing apprenticeships for the region's students, such as those studying sustainable technologies in the career technical education sector. And NVRC is also tying apprenticeships to FDI through its programs, such as the Select Talent USA program. That is a federal program that is relatively new. That helps the foreign investors build local and state partnerships with entities like NVRC and to train the workforce of the foreign direct investment companies. So with our FDI report, this one for Northern Virginia was only the second study in the country ever done on this subject matter at a regional level. Los Angeles was the first. So we based our study off of that one, but we built on it and advanced it much further than what LA did by having really advanced precedent-setting methods that utilized not only national private sector data, but we also used federal and state data, as well as the local knowledge of our economic development authorities, such as Fairfax County EDA. And we researched to identify what foreign-owned companies were located in our region, the address of those company branches. We did the country of the global headquarters and employment characteristics, which were many. We did the number of employees, number of establishments, total wages, of the employees overall, and many other level of details to understand the economy that these investing countries contribute to our region. So the level of details that the data had been summarized in our report will be industries, countries, as well as our local counties, as you'll see when you read the report. So this type of local level research that we conducted through LA and Northern Virginia has been slow to come by because there's no primary source for this type of data, and it takes a lot of quality control and really a lot of local knowledge to understand who is in a locality. So again, it's very difficult to come across this. So it took us going through many different data sources to compile our list. And so we found from this effort that it's really critical that we help strategize how to create a national database, and that we all think about how this national database of our foreign firms could be developed in the future and maintained, since it is not, and we'd love to see other regions of our country do a same sort of study that we did. And just for your information, before we go into the data, retail was excluded from this study. So all the figures you're going to see exclude retail. So what you're seeing here is a summary of all the data for Northern Virginia and how globally engaged our region really is, as we are seeing through the figures that this study has come up with. We all knew anecdotally we were very globally engaged, but how engaged? Well, there's 1,252 establishments in Northern Virginia. Establishments, by the way, are the physical location of businesses in our region. And many companies, they have multiple establishments. They'll have branches and all. So we're focused on the establishments because we wanted to know the addresses of all the businesses and where they are in our region. The foreign-owned enterprises with operations in Northern Virginia are from 67 countries, so very diverse, with the top 6 countries shown here being 2/3 of our employment. So just 6 countries out of the 67 make up a significant portion of our region. And the largest share is from the European Union. So that goes to show, highlights what Dr. Hamilton was also saying, how the EU is so critical for not only the state and the US, but also to our region. FDI accounts for 4.6% of the region's employment, with the goal being to continue to grow that with more ties to our global economy. But 4.6%, it may seem small, but that is not insignificant at all. That is really showing that we are engaged globally. We make $6.8 billion in annual wages for all the 50,879 employees that are employed with foreign-owned firms. So that again is very significant. There's 3 industries that account for 64.2% of Northern Virginia's foreign-owned establishment employment. Nearly half of those in the professional, scientific, and technical services, and the other 2 being the information sector and management of companies and enterprises sector. For those who don't know, the information sector, which I get a lot of questions on as to what is that and how does that differentiate from the technical services? The information sector includes media, communications, and social media companies that deliver and process information. So it's a lot of the digital age that is in that sector. Next. So similar to Northern Virginia's summary that you're seeing here, in our report, you'll find very similar detailed level data for the top 25 countries. Shown here are just the top 5, but in our report, we go into significant detail for the top 25. FOE in Northern Virginia has above average concentrations in industries that pay higher wages, as you see here from the list of industries. So we can't stress enough how important FOE and its contributions are to our region's economy, given the high wage employment that it brings to our region. The United Kingdom is the #1 investor in the region, with nearly a quarter of all the FOE employees in our region. And Germany is second. And with Germany being second, that really speaks volumes as to why NVRC has been and continues to engage and prioritize many relationships with partners in Germany, such as Stuttgart that I mentioned earlier. Next. So the FDI report also includes the 5 largest jurisdictions in Northern Virginia, such as Arlington, and we go into the details for each of our jurisdictions and the contributions of FDI to our region in each of its jurisdictions. So for example, with Arlington, that has a unique place in Northern Virginia's market and economy. As Arlington is, as many of you might know, office dominated. So it heavily leans to the professional, scientific, and technical services, with 67% of its FDI employment in that sector, compared to the region's foreign direct investment being 49% in that region, in that sector. So it's a very heavy presence of companies in professional, scientific, and technical, but as well as management sector at 14%, and the employment overall is, I should say, is 14% is FDI versus 5% for the region. So Arlington's very heavy on the foreign direct investment. So that's just an example of the type of analysis you'll find in the report for each of our jurisdictions. Next. This is showing you each of our jurisdictions and the employment, establishments, and wages that each contributes to the region from foreign direct investment, with Fairfax obviously being the greatest, knowing that has the region's largest population and employment size. It's no surprise that they have the largest share of the foreign direct investment in our region, having anywhere from 69% to 71% of the employment, establishments, and wages just in Fairfax County. But all the other jurisdictions have foreign direct investment as well, since we have an international airport here that drives a lot of the economy for our region as well, with ties to the rest of the world through Dulles Airport, which is located in Loudoun, and a little bit in Fairfax, but primarily Loudoun. So that's an overview of the region's foreign direct investment. And next, Dale. For more information and to go deep into the counties as well as all the industries that we showed you here, you can view it in our report, which is found on our website through these URLs and the QR codes. So we will now take time for the questions, and I'll hand it back over to Dale. Dale, you are muted.
Thanks again so much. That was fantastic. Special also thanks to Victor for kicking things off. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. I wanted to ask Dan, you talk about the effect of the research and development in the context of the innovation economy. Does that have a particularly identifiable local or regional effect? In other words, are companies in Chicago investing in R&D that has an effect that benefits directly the universities, the science and the research ecology of a Chicago or in Seattle? And I ask because it seems that there's the potential to recreate something like that here in this region.
Um, yeah, I mean, you think what you see is companies, US companies in Europe, European companies going this way, looking for, where talent is. And so where they find that is, depending on their field, of course, they're usually a metro area that's got a strong university-based community that's doing research that's relevant to what they do. You have a local government that's supportive of building those synergies. And then you can, and my colleagues at Brookings in the metro section, they've done a lot of studies showing pockets and the clusters of innovation across the United States and why those are, and that there are similar studies in Europe. And those are connected clusters. That's the point I try to make, is that that investment is fueling investment from, that innovation is fueling investment from Europe. If you take the clean tech sector, for instance, over the last few years, I did a study with the Clean Tech Group, so you can find this study on their website, where they looked at investment flows in clean technology innovation over the last 7 years. And it's very even. I think $23 billion of US investment in Europe, in European startups, and about 20 billion coming from European companies here. And the interesting thing is that in the United States, if there's a startup, which is usually tied to some sort of innovation information cluster, and they're trying to get their funding, and a European investor is part of the funders, then that startup usually gets to market faster with a bigger deal and a bigger payoff than if there was no European investor involved. It was just a US only. I think that speaks to what Jill was saying about the important role of foreign-owned, establishments in spurring this extra value that they add sometimes to give a spark to what's already going on in a region. And the same is true the other way around. When there's a US investor in a European clean tech startup, it gets to market faster, the deal is bigger than if the US wasn't involved. So this notion somehow that it's either or, which you hear political politicians talking about, just isn't borne out by the facts. That their flows are going evenly both ways. They dwarf the flows that are going anywhere else in the world. And they're being driven a lot by this notion of finding those innovation clusters that will make, best use of that type of investment.
Yeah. One of the things that Jill pointed out was the ties with workforce training and apprenticeships. And I know that you've had a lot of involvement with places like Charlotte, where German companies were investing and then applying, through Bosch and Siemens, their own experiences from across the Atlantic of the creation of apprenticeships. And I was wondering if you could just sort of share with us your observations about how that worked, but then maybe extrapolate how that would translate into the digital economy. Charlotte is, when you're dealing with Bosch and when you're dealing with Siemens, they're manufacturing turbines. We don't do that. We're the service sector. We're the digital economy. So I was wondering if you could just sort of think out loud about what you observed in places like Charlotte and what you think that might, how that might apply to a place like Northern Virginia.
Well, I think if you look across the United States and you look across Europe, you see a lot of very dense interactions between subnational actors. Everything's not going on in Washington and in European capitals. Stuttgart is an amazing connector in Europe with your region and with others. And there are other regions like that too. And what it is what I call the transatlantic domestic politics. It is leaders looking for solutions to practical problems at a regional level and finding lessons learned that are value to them half a world away. They don't have to be just down the street. Sometimes the lesson they can learn is in Europe. And many European companies or regions are learning from US experience. So one is vocational education. I can come back to that. But in terms of urban planning, and you mentioned, and you are so involved yourself in environmental planning, all sorts of regions across the United States have learned from European counterparts on how to do a lot of that. And Dale, you are a leader in that, so I know, but there are other parts of the United States. You take transportation planning, there's lots of exchange going on. You just take lots of things like that. The green roofs in Chicago were based on those in Hamburg. And your example of Charlotte, to come to the story, you know, there, Charlotte, North Carolina, economy used to be timber and tobacco, not exactly, you know, forward-looking industries. And they, over years, they turned that around. So now it is energy, and it is foreign investment, and it's financial services. So they're better positioned now than they were before. They have forward-looking, and their foreign investment helped them get through the last few economic crises that they had in both the energy and financial services areas. But the story that's, I think, relevant is we have our community college system in the United States. The Europeans don't have that. They don't know what it is really, but it's a great treasure in our country to help people, you know, either other people, older people who were working and they want to go and get their education and either finish with something at the community college or go on to a different level of education, or people out of high school are trying to get a vocational practical training. They serve a great function in our country. And in Charlotte, Central Piedmont Community College was the community college. And all of this investment was coming from Germany to Charlotte. It's the largest destination of German investment in the United States, Charlotte, North Carolina. And it's all these small companies, not big companies, but small ones. But they were finding that the Central Piedmont Community College graduates weren't exactly equipped from the curriculum of the college to match what they needed in their jobs. So the president of the college worked with those companies. They worked with the Carolinas Partnership, which would be your equivalent in that region. And they worked with the Chamber of Commerce in Karlsruhe, Germany, near Stuttgart, which has a partnership relationship, to create a curriculum that was attuned to the needs of those companies. And it was different in some ways than what they had been doing. And to add to it, it was certified as equivalent training by the Karlsruhe Chamber of Commerce. So the German companies knew what they were getting because their own Chamber of Commerce back home said this is equivalent to what usually we educate people about. And so it became a great funnel of these community college graduates going right into the big paying, good paying jobs in those foreign investment enterprises. So if you transfer that, tapping the potential of our community college system, I think to think about training and jobs is and tie it to foreign investment and the needs of those companies, is they're coming from a different, tradition. And thinking of them as partners in that could be a great thing. And if you think about the digital economy, and as I mentioned, clean tech and services, Jill's, if you look at Jill's stats, what were the top 3 professions? It was services, technical services, and information, which is the digital economy, and then only something else, management. But the top 2 so the majority of jobs were in the services economy or digital. So that's where I think you could build on that. Digital training, how do you train people for the digital world? And how do community colleges fit into that, or the regional innovation economy? Those are things that's the future kind of economy that we're talking about, where the foreign investors can be our partners in that.
Yeah, we actually have a webinar that we're trying to structure exactly on that topic in September. The first question was, do you have an example of a digitally enabled service?
Sure. Things that you can send with a click of a button. So architectural design, right?
Yeah.
An architect creates their design and they send it across the ocean to their customer, and it's worth millions of dollars. And it was just one, one chart, one PDF maybe. So that's a digitally deliverable service because you provided that service and you just send it that way. That's a simple one, but there are many, like that. Any service you can provide these days that can be transferred, over the internet would fit into that dynamic. So if you think about social services provisions, professional services, again, if you think about the medical world today, lots of doctors are doing things using services provided by technicians somewhere else in the world. And then they send them their documents overnight, and then they look at them for your patients. Things like that are happening that are quite incredible.
Fred Hansen asks, given that Ukraine will need to increase investment and trade opportunities to recover from Russia's invasion, is Nova making any efforts to develop ties with this beleaguered country? And then adds, was Russia ever a significant trade and investment partner with Nova? And if so, did any of this survive sanctions? With respect to the latter question, I can't speak because we did this data only recently. My sense is that and Victor's probably in a better position to answer this. I'm not sure that Russia was ever a significant trade and investment partner, but I'll defer to the experts. With respect to the Ukraine, I believe that there's a sister city partnership between Arlington and I don't know specifically the town. I'm aware that our executive director, Bob Lazaro, led a blanket drive to deliver blankets, jackets back to the Ukrainians in early 2000, maybe mid 2022, shortly after the invasion. But the data demonstrates that Ukraine is not so high in the investment or list of countries investing actually in this region. Does that answer your question, Fritz?
I could just maybe add that, our economic ties with Russia were always very thin, mainly in energy, some energy ties. But other than that, never very thin. It was Europe's ties with Russia were very thick in many different ways, and that's changing now with the sanctions. But on Ukraine, efforts are just getting geared up now to help the Ukrainians. Former Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker is leading the U.S. side of that. They just had a major investment conference in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago. It was in Berlin, but it was about Ukraine. President Zelensky came to that. A lot of companies are starting to, they're in the middle of a war. And it's hard to know how to help rebuild, although 80% of the country's, not the front line. But the Russians are targeting not just the front lines, they're targeting all of Ukrainian society, including cities very, very far away, and hospitals and schools and you name it. And so the trade-off there is, how do you start to rebuild? They really do have to do that. They still have things to work through in terms of the legacy, Soviet legacy, which involves things like corruption and so on, but they are determined now, I think, in my view, to do that. And, in the end, Ukraine is a very rich country. It's just have been poorly run. It is amazing energy resources. It is amazing agricultural resources. It had major manufacturing. And it is just started negotiation with the European Union to join the European Union, which won't happen for a while. But if you take a look at the map and you think Ukraine is part of the EU, that would be significant also for US companies, because when the EU expanded after the Cold War to take in much of Central and Eastern Europe, US companies did what the Europeans did. They expanded their operations across the single market. That was my example of Poland and what US companies have done. They will do that in spades if we get to the point where Ukraine's part of the EU. It's, next to Germany, it's the largest country in Europe, and it's going to be a major thing. So that's the future. It's not today, but certainly it could be something We just have a war, of course, now we're dealing with at the moment.
Victor, did you want to add to that?
Well, I don't think I could add to anything Dr. Hamilton just laid out. He's absolutely right, and but we're ready to help them when they're ready to receive that help. But we can't proceed the situation that they're in right now.
Right. I just wanted to say thank you guys so much for your time. We've hit the 1 o'clock hour, and I see the attendees are starting to go back to their jobs away from lunch. The webinar. Thank you so much, everybody, for helping us, and we look forward to working with you guys.
Thank you, Dale. And Dr. Hamilton, pleasure to meet you. Jill, thank you so
Same
much.
here. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Rebecca. All right, bye-bye.